The people of the Earth Kingdom are proud and strong. They can endure anything as long as they have hope.
Yes, you're right.
You will learn respect, and suffering will be your teacher. These chilling words from Fire Lord Ozai came right before he scarred his 13-year-old son for life. But what kind of monster was hiding behind the Fire Lord's throne? The signs of Ozai's abuse appeared throughout the series, but many viewers missed how calculated his cruelty toward Zuko truly was. From making Zuko believe he was worthless to pitting him against Azula, Ozai's psychological warfare began when Zuko was barely old enough to firebend. After the scarring, Zuko was left trembling, his world shattered by betrayal from the person meant to protect him, a public punishment designed to break his spirit completely. Did you know Ozai actually wanted to throw baby Zuko away because he didn't think he had the spark of a firebender? The abuse that marked Zuko's life began literally at birth. The moment Ozai held his newborn son, he examined the infant's eyes, searching for that distinctive gleam that would indicate firebending potential. But what he saw disappointed him deeply. In the comics that expand the Avatar universe, we learned that Ozai suggested to Ursa that they abandon their seemingly worthless son. This moment reveals something truly disturbing about Ozai's character, viewing his children as extensions of himself and his legacy rather than individuals to cherish. The comics show how he scrutinized baby Zuko's eyes, searching for that fire-bending spark, and when he found none, his disappointment manifested as rejection. Conditional love became the blueprint for their relationship from day one. Imagine being judged as inadequate before you could even speak or walk, establishing a lifetime of desperate attempts to earn approval deliberately kept out of reach. Like a scale permanently tipped to one side, everything changed when Azula was born. The comics illustrate how Ozai immediately recognized something special in baby Azula's eyes, that fire-bending spark he found lacking in Zuko. From their very first days, Ozai established a hierarchy between his children based solely on their potential usefulness to him, evaluating them as assets versus liabilities. Thankfully, Ursa intervened when Ozai suggested discarding Zuko. Her maternal protection saved the baby prince, but she couldn't fully shield him from the emotional coldness that would define his relationship with his father. Even as an infant, Zuko existed in an environment where his very right to exist was questioned. The psychological impact of this early rejection runs surprisingly deep. Even though Zuko couldn't possibly remember these events directly, the emotional foundation was already being laid. Developmental psychologists have long understood that the parent-child bond formed in infancy shapes how we view ourselves and our worthiness of love throughout life. For Zuko, that foundation was built on conditional acceptance and the constant threat of rejection. The seeds of rejection planted during Zuko's infancy bloomed into a garden of psychological warfare as the royal siblings grew older. What if Azula's cruelty towards Zuko wasn't entirely her natural personality, but something deliberately cultivated by their father? The truth about how Ozai pitted his children against each other reveals an even darker dimension to his abuse than what we saw on screen. Ozai's primary tactic was engineering a toxic rivalry between his children, a rigged game where Zuko could never win and Azula could never lose. During firebending practice, he would position Zuko to witness Azula's prodigious skills, making sure his son observed every perfect form and technique she executed. "Very good, Azula. Your form is flawless," he would announce loudly enough for Zuko to hear, before turning to his son with a calculated look of disappointment. "Why can't you be more like your sister?" This systematic program of psychological manipulation included scheduling Zuko's training immediately after Azula's, ensuring he would always appear inadequate by comparison. When Zuko mastered a basic form after days of practice, Ozai would shrug dismissively, while Azula's advanced techniques earned lavish praise that echoed through the palace halls. The most insidious aspect was how Ozai rewarded Azula's cruelty. Whenever she mocked Zuko's failures or humiliated him, Ozai responded with approving smiles or outright laughter, teaching Azula that tormenting her brother was a path to their father's affection. "Dad's going to kill you," she would taunt with a smile. Knowing her role as the messenger of her father's disapproval elevated her status. The psychological impact devastated both children. For Zuko, home became a battlefield where he faced attacks from multiple directions. For Azula, her father's conditional love created a desperate perfectionist who internalized that worth came from power and cruelty. Ozai deliberately praised qualities in Azula that represented his twisted values. Her capacity for deception, her exploitation exploitation of weaknesses, her ruthless pursuit of power. When Zuko showed compassion or honor, Ozai labeled these as weaknesses, actively punishing the very characteristics that would eventually define Zuko's redemption. By weaponizing Azula against Zuko, Ozai created an efficient system of abuse that continued even in his absence, with Azula becoming his proxy and extending his psychological torment. Amid this ruthless father-daughter alliance, one figure stood between Zuko and complete destruction, his mother Ursa. But did you ever wonder why the woman who loved her son enough to commit treason for him couldn't protect him from his father's most horrific acts of abuse? The tragic truth about Ursa's limited power in the royal household explains why Zuko's greatest protector ultimately became his greatest loss. Remember that moment in the series when Zuko told Azula, "My mother thought I was a monster"? He was throwing Azula's own words back at her, revealing the deep resentment in their family. While Ursa poured affection into Zuko to counterbalance Ozai's cruelty, Azula felt abandoned by her mother's attention. Ursa was essentially a prisoner within the palace walls. Forced into marriage with Ozai through manipulation and threats, her movements were constantly monitored and her interactions strictly controlled. Despite these constraints, she fought to provide Zuko with the emotional foundation his father sought to destroy. Her whispered affirmations to Zuko when Ozai wasn't present became her most powerful weapon. "You are perfect exactly as you are," she would tell him, creating moments of normalcy by teaching him to feed the turtle ducks and celebrating his smallest achievements. These simple actions were acts of resistance against Ozai's psychological warfare, building a competing narrative in Zuko's mind about his own worth. This protection created a dangerous psychological split for Zuko. Receiving contradictory messages about his value forced him to develop two separate identities: the confident child under his mother's care and the shameful failure under his father's judgment. When Ursa learned Ozai had agreed to kill Zuko to satisfy Fire Lord Aslan's cruel demand, she made the ultimate sacrifice. She concocted an untraceable poison, assassinated the Fire Lord, and fled into exile to protect her son. But in saving Zuko's life, she left him completely vulnerable to his father's unchecked abuse. Psychological research confirms that even one supportive parent can buffer the trauma of having an abusive parent. With Ursa gone, Zuko lost his only source of unconditional love and his defender against Ozai's increasingly brutal treatment. The timing couldn't have been worse. Zuko was entering adolescence, a critical period for identity formation, without anyone to validate his emerging sense of self. Without his mother's protection, Zuko stood completely vulnerable to whatever cruelty Ozai might inflict next. The Fire Nation values strength and perfection above all else, so when Ozai deliberately scarred his son's face in front of the entire court, he was sending a message that would follow Zuko for the rest of his life. Let's look at what actually happened during that infamous Agni Kai. 13-year-old Zuko spoke out during a war meeting because he was concerned about sacrificing new recruits as bait. For this small act of compassion, Ozai declared that Zuko had shown disrespect and demanded a ritual fire duel. But here's the cruel twist. Zuko thought he would be facing the elderly general he had spoken against. Instead, when he turned to face his opponent, he discovered his own father standing there. The hushed whispers of the court filled the chamber as Zuko's eyes widened with terror. Imagine being a young teenager suddenly realizing you're expected to fight your all-powerful father in front of hundreds of witnesses. Ozai had engineered this scenario perfectly. He knew his son would never raise a hand against him. When Zuko immediately fell to his knees, begging for forgiveness, Ozai walked slowly toward his kneeling son, his footsteps echoing in the silent hall. "You will learn respect," Ozai declared to his sobbing child, "and suffering will be your teacher." The choice to burn Zuko's face rather than any other part of his body reveals Ozai's truly sadistic nature. Trauma specialists recognize that facial disfigurement carries unique psychological consequences. Every time Zuko looked in a mirror, he would see his failure. Every person who met him would immediately notice his scar, forcing him to constantly relive his shame. Azula's smirking presence in the audience compounds the trauma, as the sizzling sound of flesh burning mixed with gasps from horrified onlookers, sounds that would haunt Zuko's nightmares for years. After this brutal assault, Ozai immediately banished his injured son, sending him away on an impossible quest to capture the Avatar, who hadn't been seen for 100 years, as the sole condition for restoring his honor. This wasn't punishment, it was exile designed to ensure Zuko would never return. The exile was just the beginning of a much darker strategy that extended well beyond physical cruelty. While the scar Ozai branded on Zuko's face ensured everyone would see his shame, behind that visible mark lay an invisible prison season of psychological manipulation. Zuko remained captive to his father's influence even across oceans, trapped behind bars of shame and desperation that followed him everywhere. Ozai's psychological warfare operated through a calculated system of control. By setting the capture of the long-vanished Avatar as the sole path to redemption, Ozai created what psychologists identify as a trauma bond, a powerful attachment where victims become obsessively devoted to winning approval they can never actually obtain. Research shows these bonds can persist for decades, even when the abuser is physically absent. Think about it. Zuko spent 3 years sailing the world, following even the faintest rumors of the Avatar's existence, all while carrying the weight of an entire nation's rejection on his shoulders. This impossible task kept Zuko isolated from potential support systems, forced him to internalize blame for his situation, and prevented him from questioning whether his father's approval was worth seeking at all. The rare moments Ozai offered tiny glimmers of validation strengthened this attachment through intermittent reinforcement, creating an addiction-like dependency where Zuko constantly chased increasingly rare moments of approval, just like a gambling addict pursues the next win. What makes this form of abuse so devastating is how it rewires the victim's entire understanding of fundamental concepts. For Zuko, honor became twisted into blind obedience rather than moral integrity. Respect meant submission rather than mutual recognition. Even love was corrupted into a transaction, something that had to be earned through impossible achievements rather than freely given. Look at how this conditioning manifested in Zuko's behavior throughout the early seasons. His volatile emotional outbursts, his inability to accept failure, his desperate need to prove himself worthy. These weren't character flaws, but natural responses to years of systematic psychological abuse. Even his confusion about his own identity in later seasons stems directly from Ozai's manipulation, as he struggled to determine who he was outside of his father's narrow definitions of worth. While Ozai's abuse left deep psychological scars that shaped Zuko's behavior, there was one thing the Fire Lord never anticipated: that his son would find the strength to completely shatter the generational cycle of abuse that had poisoned the Fire Nation royal family for centuries. What makes Zuko's journey so remarkable is that he overcame abuse and managed to break free entirely from the toxic patterns that threatened to define him. Throughout seasons 1 and 2, we watch Zuko desperately clinging to his father's value system, believing that capturing the Avatar would somehow heal the wound in his soul. When he finally returned to the Fire Nation in season 3, with Aang supposedly dead in Ba Sing Se, Zuko received his father's approval and his royal position back, but felt emptier than ever before. The day of Black Sun Eclipse marked his true turning point. Facing Ozai directly, Zuko declared, "I'm going to join the Avatar and I'm going to help him defeat you." This confrontation represented Zuko reclaiming his identity. Trauma recovery specialists note that confronting an abuser allows victims to externalize blame they've incorrectly internalized for years. His healing process depended on finding better models for family and love. Uncle Iroh offered guidance without domination and unconditional love when he told Zuko, "I was never angry with you. I was sad because I was afraid you'd lost your way." This moment showed Zuko that parental love could exist without conditions, something completely foreign to his experience. Team Avatar gave him peer relationships based on trust rather than fear. When Katara threatened him at the Western Air Temple, Zuko witnessed how real families protect each other out of genuine care, not obligation or fear as he had experienced in the royal household. Avatar's storytelling brilliantly shows healing as an ongoing process. Even after choosing the right path, Zuko struggled with anger and self-doubt. When visiting the Sun Warriors, he had to learn firebending without rage, transforming his father's toxic legacy into something life-affirming. His journey wasn't just about choosing sides, but about rebuilding himself completely. And so we come to the end of Zuko's story, a powerful reminder that our deepest wounds don't determine our destiny. When he finally stood before Ozai during the eclipse, rejecting everything his father represented, Zuko broke a generational curse that had poisoned the Fire Nation for centuries. Perhaps the most important lesson is about us. We all carry scars, visible or hidden, and Zuko shows us that healing means incorporating those scars into a new identity built on compassion rather than cruelty. The true miracle is that despite everything, he emerged as his father's antithesis, proving our histories shape us but never define us. What scars are you transforming today?